My name is Mia. If you asked me before all of this who I was, I would have given you an ordinary answer. One that fits neatly into the cardboard box of a life people accept without complaint. I worked the hours that paid the rent, I laughed when friends expected it. I loved Thomas in the way you love a familiar city. By habit, by route, by memory. He was clever in small, precise ways. Knowing my coffee order before I could think, leaving his jacket when I'd forgotten mine, sending me photos of sunsets with a single word home. I believed him. I wanted to believe him. They say that betrayal changes you. That's only half true. Betrayal didn't invent me. It cleaned away the soft things until the shape beneath was sharp enough to cut. I learned that truth on an October night, the kind when wind stabs at the windows and the kind of darkness that swallows sound. It began with the phone. I had found it sometime in the early afternoon. Slim, metal, a little too pristine for Thomas's clumsy hands. He'd left it on the kitchen table, the screen smudged with fingerprints and a smear of jam from breakfast. I told myself I would put it back. I told myself I wouldn't separate him from privacy like an archaeologist risks breaking a relic. But curiosity is the light that illuminates every cracked place in your life. I pressed his thumb to the glass and felt, absurdly, like an intruder at my own house. The lock opened easily because of muscle memory I'd never known. The angle of his thumb on the sensor, the tilt of his hand. The screen lit up with a cluster of messages he had not yet deleted. One name kept surfacing. Elena. She had a laugh emoji in every thread, the kind of laughter that looks like sunshine trapped in a GIF. At first I pretended it was nothing. Colleagues, old friends. Then the breadcrumbs led to photos, and the photos led to a hotel reservation, and the reservation led to April 12th last year, a day I had thought was merely ordinary. I don't remember how I got out of the apartment. The city that night was a set of neon reflections. I walked without deciding to, as if the pavement itself had directions for me. I thought of confrontation. I thought of turning the phone into an accusation. But I knew Thomas. He would explain. He would smile. He would use that smile like a coat to shield whatever lay under it. I knew I wanted him to be ashamed in the way people are ashamed in movies. Red and loud and repentant. I wanted a scene. What I did not in that moment know was how a more patient, quieter thing would serve me. Revenge, I learned, is an architecture. It needs a blueprint, patience, and the courage to be small in its beginnings. I became patient the way a sculptor becomes patient. With time, with a slow removal of pieces that almost look like the finished thing. I watched from the outside at first. Not from his house. That would have been obvious. From the margins. I started with Elena. Instagram, thin patterns of sunlight and cropped faces, a carousel of coastal photos, a textbook bright life. Her feed said what Thomas's hands had not. She liked risk in small doses, scuba dives, rooftop bars, black coffee. Her location tags were minimal, until she slipped. She posted from a boutique hotel downtown on a night Thomas claimed to be working late. I took a screenshot. The shutter sound in my mouth was loud. For 2 weeks I built a map of them. Dates, times, the language of their exchanges. I discovered things about Thomas the first didn't like. His casual cruelty and jokes when the glass of wine tilted the wrong way. The way he called me Mia Bear in front of friends as if possession could be sweetened by a pet name. There were financial transactions on payday, small sums moved to someone named Elena, and photos of him with his arm around a woman in a red dress that I had not been in. When the first human plan developed in my chest, it was not violent. I intended embarrassment. I would let everyone know in the language they used. They would find the truth mildly scandalous, a little tragic. I opened a burner email. I wrote anonymous notes. I sent a single photograph to a group chat where our lives intersected. College friends, colleagues, a few family members. The message was minimal. I thought you should know. Attached, a picture of Thomas and Elena, close, eyes soft in a hotel dimness. Maybe I had imagined the narcissistic satisfaction of watching Thomas crumble. In reality, nothing happened. The chat blew over like a small storm. Friends sent the usual platitudes. I'm here if you need to talk. Thomas, when confronted, turned the narrative with a practiced hand. It was nothing, he said. Just a mistake. He knew how to make the world switch its gaze away, and it did. My friends folded themselves in on themselves, wanting to be helpful without choosing sides. They were afraid of becoming accessories in someone else's pain. So I learned to be quieter. That's when the architecture turned complicated. If scandal had no teeth, Perhaps economic damage might. Thomas had a job everyone admired. A consultancy that moved with the low, smug confidence of success. I watched his routine the way people read weather. Predictably and with a resigned acceptance. He liked fine things. Watches, meals with names that tasted like money, a car that hummed expensive. I started small. A misfiled invoice here, a delayed response to a client email there. Tiny strokes. Subtleties that accumulated into an image. I timed when he paid for parking and slipped a coupon into his windshield that said parking ticket. I arranged for his presentation slides to go missing the day he needed them for a pitch. Each incident felt guilty and necessary, like every small cut on a tree that, together, would change its form. Thomas was good at damage control. He apologized, blamed a system. Charm made an alibi for everything. He loved being the man who could hold a broken thing in his hands and fix it. But I had time and strategy. Embarrassment worked in short bursts. Financial discomfort lingered. A consultancy can't survive on charm alone. Clients are merciless. They measure errors in lost hours and audible sighs. I pushed those errors, patient as erosion, until doubt seeped into the rooms where he worked. In the meantime, I learned Elena's rhythms. She frequented an art gallery on Thursdays. She took a vinyasa class in the mornings. She had a dog, a border collie named Pippin, who wore bandanas and looked like he'd been stolen from a children's book. I started showing up in unlikely places. Not to be seen as a stalker. God, the word stalker is so small and misused, but as a presence, an invisible thread through their days. I sat in the corner of cafes while they met. I waved at them across crowded rooms while they conversed with people who never seemed to look deeply enough. I learned their favorite restaurants. I took notes on the way they kissed, hurried, like they were trying to finish a task. That knowledge does something to you. It makes you meticulous. It makes you patient. It also gives you options. I began to imagine not only how to hurt Thomas, but how to do so without him seeing the architecture. Men like him are good at watching, but poor at introspection. They miss the fine lines of a plan that grows in plain sight. And then I made a choice with a gravity I had not anticipated. I would not merely take his career or his reputation. I would expose the difference between the man he pretended to be and the man he actually was. That required evidence. Solid, undeniable, the kind that makes people change seats and look at you like a stranger who just spoke the truth about someone's teeth. So I started to film. No, not in a way that breaks into laws. I recorded natural moments. Conversations where Thomas let rip with casual cruelty, where Elena laughed and whispered things that suggested more than friendship, where his hand brushed hers in a way that made me imagine touch as a graph of intent. I used the camera on my phone, kept it hidden beneath a coffee table, on a bookshelf, in the hollow of a shopping bag. I learned angles. I learned to be patient until life made the footage for me. The first video I saved was from a Thursday at the gallery. Thomas and Elena stood close to a painting that was almost all blue, and they spoke in low tones that were only human. Thomas said, "You know how she is, always so." And Elena laughed, leaning in. The camera caught the laugh and the hand. It is strange what technology preserves. Small gestures that our minds are terrible at holding. Armed with footage and financial irregularities, I planned the reveal. I did not want a drama. I wanted a surgical incision. I sent copies of the footage to Thomas's director at the consultancy with an anonymous note. "Your senior partner is not the man you think he is. Please find attached proof of his personal indiscretions and irregular expenses." I timed the email to go at the moment their quarterly review was in motion. I did the same with evidence of his financial mismanagement, bank transfers, suspicious consultancy invoices that matched dates of trips with Elena. And then, for the first time since the first photograph, something changed. The difference between being the woman who knows and the woman who acts became visible. People began to circle. Not his friends. No, they were still farmed by habit and fear, but professional predators. Competitors, clients with eyes like knives, journalists who smelled scandal. Thomas reacted like any man who has spent his life negotiating perception. He leaned into denial. He said they were all mistakes. He ran to meetings with his hands folded and his face a practiced blank. But what was done was done. Contracts were renegotiated. The consultancy paused promotions. Their clients, suddenly skittish, asked for reassurances. His veneer was not gone, but the cracks had become a map. At night, I watched him sleep and felt at once triumph and a strange bitter emptiness. He came home altered. He asked me once if I had seen something. I told him calmly that I had not. I told no one that I had. In the mornings he kissed me with a new urgency, as though what had been stolen could be bought back. It couldn't. Not entirely. When the legal letters started to arrive, formal, thin envelopes that sounded like a guillotine, they were not addressed to me but to Thomas. He fought back. He filed defamation suits, threatened contempt, sent men with clipped hair and clipped voices to my work to ask questions. These men looked at me as though I had broken something precious and laughably mine to take. They were surprised when I spoke. I wasn't afraid. I had no criminal record, no need to keep one. I had a ledger, I had time, I had patience. That's when the plan took a darker shape. Revenge, I realized, is not merely social or financial. It is a rewriting of the story told about you. For months he had been the protagonist in his own story. Charming, problem-solving, the man who could fix small disasters into larger narratives of resilience. I would write a new story. I became someone I did not recognize in small moments. I dyed my hair darker, learned to speak in thinner sentences at parties, to look away at the right moment. I practiced neutral expressions until my face did not betray what was inside. I bought a small notebook and wrote down lines I would use. Exact phrases that would, when placed strategically, undo him further. I rehearsed them in the mirror with surgical attention, as if I were training a muscle. Then I began to talk to his clients. Not as myself, no, that would be too obvious. I created a persona, a hard-working consultant turned whistleblower. I approached them online with facts, numbers, gentle insinuations. I built a narrative of errors that went beyond personal failings, of systemic mismanagement. I forwarded them a binder. I used language they respected, metrics, benchmarks, inefficiencies. I sent them the footage with Thomas and Elena tagged as personal distractions affecting professional conduct. The videos were not salacious. They were ordinary, which is what made them corrosive. The more ordinary the betrayal, the more intimate the injury to trust. It worked. One by one, clients asked questions not of Thomas but of the firm. They demanded audits. They wanted leaders with different profiles. A consultancy lives on the intangible. Trust. Take that away and the rest is brittle. Now, if this sounds like a slow and petty war, know that machines of bureaucracy are lethal in their own way. A missed contract here, a skeptical client there. These are tiny cuts that become a hemorrhage. Thomas's promotions stalled. His colleagues looked at him differently. He tried to be transparent, but transparency is exploited by people who are already suspicious. And then the twist I had not anticipated, the human cost. For revenge to be complete, I realized there was one more thing to take, his pride. In a final, deliberate move, I arranged for a press leak. Not a wide, sensationalist article, but a precise, well-placed story in a trade magazine that examined ethics in consulting. It mentioned a senior partner under investigation for personal misconduct and financial irregularities. The magazine did not name him directly. But anyone who cared to look, who worked the same circles, would recognize the details. Dates, clients, habits. My hands shook when I hit send. For the first time since I began, I felt the rawness of what I had created. It was not just about seeing him fall. It was about watching a person lose pieces of themselves while still insisting they were whole. Thomas came home that night as if the air had been sucked out of his lungs. He was thinner, as if worry had ground him down. He moved through rooms like a person in a house that no longer belonged to him. He looked at me and his eyes were a question. I didn't answer. I had nothing to say. What I had wanted, what I had needed, was not merely his discomfort. It was recognition of what he had done, public and undeniable. I had imagined that when it came, he would collapse in a grand confession, sweep all mistakes into a flood of apologies, and seek forgiveness as if it were the only clean thing left. Instead, he became a man who oscillated between rage and emptiness, someone who had been hollowed out by consequence. Elena vanished from his life like a name erased from a page. I never confronted her. Some people are victims without knowing they are victims. Some are conspirators without knowing the consequences. She moved away. Pippin, the dog, went to a neighbor. You might think now that this is a triumphant moment for me. And in some ways it was. He lost clients. His professional reputation became a cautionary tale. He asked for help, for forgiveness, for anything, but it is remarkable how often people want to fix the consequences instead of the action that caused them. I had given him both and it was insufficient. But victory, I learned, is not a clean thing. It carries with it residue. I learned to identify that residue in my sleep, the half-formed fear that I had become too much like him, the constant replay of the small trade-offs of a life unscrupulous enough to achieve its ends. Revenge consumes only the part that is needed, but it also consumes some of you. It pulls you into a contour that can be hard to escape. So I did a final thing. I knew that the most dangerous weapon Thomas wielded was narrative. His ability to turn anything into a story where he remained the hero. I decided to take his story away. I sold him to the world as he had been. Fallible, ordinary, cruel in small ways. I wrote an anonymous letter to his closest friends with the kind of honesty people avoid because honesty is a fast and slippery thing. I sent them the footage, the financial records, the invoice mismatches, the client complaints. I delivered it on a gray morning and watched as people who had once borrowed his jokes now kept conversations short. I watched as his mother, the only person whose love had been an immovable thing for him, asked him over the phone why he had been spending nights at the office. He fell further than I expected. There was a night later, when he came to the apartment with a bag of things and a new smaller look on his face. He stood in the doorway, the city lights painting a pale stripe across his cheek. He had a letter in his hand. Something he had written, perhaps, and didn't know whom to give it to. He looked like a man who had finally learned to ask for forgiveness and had run out of people to ask. I listened to him make small apologies. He tried to explain. He used words like momentary lapse and confusion, as if language could soften the edges of a betrayal. I had rehearsed a speech for this too. But the speech was unnecessary. There was a different victory in the silence that he couldn't turn into a monologue. He spoke, the words spilling thinly, and then he stopped. I asked him a single question. Do you understand what you did? His answer was a small broken thing. I think so. It was not a confession. It was not even a full apology. It was the best I would get. I let him go. Not as some melodramatic climax but with the calm of someone who has tended a fire until it exhausts itself. He left the apartment because the world around him had become inhospitable. He left not because I had humiliated him into leaving, but because the scaffolding that kept the person he pretended to be had been taken down. A man who cannot convince people of his worth eventually is left with the truth, unadorned and unhelpful. In the quiet that followed, I felt a strange emptiness and a strange freedom. The house was still, except for the ordinary sounds of a life I had once considered ordinary. The kettle singing, the radiator sighing, the refrigerator humming. People ask if revenge tastes like justice. Sometimes it tastes like cold coffee and sometimes like steel. For me, it tasted like the slow, deliberate reorganization of a life. I had rewritten a narrative. I had taken back what had been stolen from me, not because I wanted to cause pain for its own sake, but because I wanted to show what the truth looked like when someone refused to let it be smoothed over. There were consequences I hadn't counted. Friends who grew distant, the awkwardness at family gatherings where Thomas's absence was a presence of its own, the way I sometimes caught myself rehearsing the next possible slight and feeling the pull of a darker habit. I had become vigilant in ways I regretted and in ways I approved. It was a trade like everything else. Months later, I met someone at a bookstore. He had ink-stained fingers and a laugh that could break heavy silence. We argued about an author and then, over coffee, we agreed. He told me gentle truths and I told him sharper ones. He never asked about Thomas. I never lied. Sometimes the past came up like a moon in the rearview, and we watched it pass. One evening, he asked me why I had been so patient. Why did I create an architecture instead of shouting the truth? I thought about it and answered simply. Because I wanted him to be accountable in the same currency he used to hurt me, public confidence. He nodded, but I saw in his eyes a question I would not answer. Does it make you happy? He asked. I paused. If you ask me honestly, I will not say it made me pure or better. It didn't. It made me wholer in the way a repaired vase is wholer. It will still bear a crack, but the crack is now part of its story. It made me less naive, and perhaps less kind in easy ways. It made me braver in other ways. In the end, victory is not a shout. It is a quiet state of being. It is waking up and finding the weight of worry a little less heavy. It is hearing a news segment about ethics and feeling that the world had tilted, just slightly, toward fairness. It is knowing that the man who loved me like an owner had been exposed and had to rebuild himself without the tools of deceit. This is not a tale of catharsis. I do not recommend following my path. It is dangerous, intricate, and it demands parts of you that can be hard to regain. But if you find yourself at the edge of something that is not merely a betrayal but a violation of the person you are, know this. You can plan, you can be patient, you can gather evidence with a slow and steady hand. You can choose instruments that hurt only what needs to be hurt. There are different ways to take back your story. Mine was surgical, not spectacular. My name is Mia. I am not proud of everything I did. I am not ashamed of it either. I learned the borders of my courage and the economics of consequence. I learned that a life can be rearranged when someone chooses to stop being naive about what they deserve. Revenge is a tool. Ugly, efficient, and sometimes necessary. Use it carefully. After Thomas left, the apartment smelled like his cologne for a week. A stale, expensive scent that clung to the curtains and the bookshelf. I opened the windows until the radiator complained and let the city slide back in. For a while I believed the world would rearrange itself around the new silence and that whatever I had done would settle like dust. But silence is porous. It hears things you no longer want to. The first sign that the game had not ended arrived in a plain envelope with no return address. Inside was a single photograph. Thomas, at a bar I had never seen him enter, laughing with a man whose face I recognized but whose name I did not. There was a notation on the back in a handwriting that was not Thomas's. Careful. Not all of them crumble. Simple. Menacing. The inked threat fit into my palm like a small, heavy stone. I should have burned the photo. Instead I pocketed it. There was a thrill to being noticed by the machine I had wound up, an acknowledgement, clumsy as it was, that the ripple I'd made had reached someone else. But the thrill was cold. I understood then that vengeance, like a coin tossed into a well, rings out until the sound fades, but sometimes, if the well is deep enough, the coin comes back up with others stuck to it. People changed their behavior around me. That was inevitable. The bookstore man, Owen, with his ink-stained fingers and calm laugh, kept his distance when Thomas's name surfaced, and I did not blame him. He had, perhaps, enough of his own turbulence to avoid riding mine. I learned to live with small absences. Friends who called less, invitations that thinned, the way conversations narrowed to safe topics. It felt like living in a city of polite ghosts. Then a new pattern emerged. Threats at first were private. An anonymous message slipped under the door, a voicemail that breathed and hung up. Whispers of legal action became louder until one late afternoon when a woman came to my doorstep with an ID and a file. She introduced herself as Amelia Kane, investigator for a firm specializing in corporate misconduct. Her tone was professional, not accusatory. She was precise in a way guilty people seldom are. "You're Mia?" she asked. Her eyes catalogued me, the way the left sleeve of my sweater was rolled, the small cut on my thumbnail, like someone reading a ledger. "Yes," I said. "How can I help?" She presented a legal document and a question I had expected in one form or another. Had I been involved in the release of certain materials? Her voice did not hide the subtext. The consultancy had hired counsel, and they were not content with the public humiliation. They had sunk money into finding the person behind the leak. A law firm with the patience and resources of a corporation can make a life small in a very particular way. They asked and they dug. I knew their kind. I thought about being honest. I thought briefly about confessing to Amelia everything. The photos, the payments, the slow, surgical architecture of the revenge. Then I remembered how Thomas had folded narratives into silences and how justice had not cared the shape of my grief. Amelia's questions were a net. Whether I answered or not, the net would shrink. "I don't know anything about that," I said. The words were thin, but they were legal. True enough in the way people bend truth into survivable shapes. Amelia made a note, soft as a habit, and left. The file she left behind contained other things. Client complaints that went deeper than the emails I had sent, a ledger of transfers I hadn't known about, and an attached photograph, the same man from the other envelope. His eyes in the photo were cold and precise. After she left I realized there were other players in this world than the ones I had planned for. Men like him, call them protectors, call them debt collectors of reputation, orbited around men like Thomas. They were not sentimental. They calculated. They were, by trade, the kind of people who do unpleasant work without blinking. That night I called Owen. For the first time since we'd met, I told him things. I did not confess everything. I do not think there is a complete confession that is useful. Honesty can be a weapon and a gift in equal measure. I told him that the past had claws. He listened, a steady presence, and then he offered something I had not expected. A name. He had once worked in a publication, and knew the undercurrents of the city's more reputational industries. The man in the photograph, he said, had ties to clients Thomas had left unsettled. He had kept a file on the consultancy, enough to make a phone ring at midnight and a heart race. We were both playing a risky game. Owen's involvement was a different kind of architecture. One built on companionship instead of calculation. For the first time since the campaign began, someone else's presence felt like a proper foundation. He insisted we meet during daylight hours in a cafe whose baristas did not ask questions. His fingers brushed mine across the table when he handed me a folder. In it were transaction receipts I hadn't seen, names that intersected my ledger. The web was wider than I'd imagined. Offshore accounts, a shadow company used to launder expense reports, a network of favors traded like coins in dim rooms. That discovery changed things. It introduced leverage other than scandal. It introduced danger too. I had wanted to punish Thomas for the private cruelty he'd inflicted. I had not planned to uncover a machine that could reach back into my life and twist it. The people behind that machine were patient. They were good at waiting for fear to corrode resolve. In the days that followed, I began to notice a car parked 2 buildings down. It wasn't menacing in a cinematic way. No dark tint, no obvious tailing. Just ordinary, a gray sedan, a chipped bumper. It waited. I learned its habits. I learned the pattern of the driver's brakes and the bookstore man's routine and the route Pippin used to take in his old life. This was professional surveillance. Calibrated. Quiet. It is a peculiar sensation knowing someone watches you and that they find you worth watching. I considered quitting. I considered erasing myself from the grid. Shutting accounts, switching phones, moving. But the architecture I had built was not only destructive, it was also revealing. There was a satisfaction in being the one who knew, the one who controlled what truth got out. I decided instead to build defenses. If someone wanted to pry my life open, I would become a harder thing to read. So I adapted. I changed routines. I set traps that were almost ceremonious in their simplicity. I mailed invoices to addresses that did not exist. I uploaded false files that were spikes in a net and watched as they were discovered and, later, used to trace who had access to them. The gray sedan slowed its patience and then, one evening, a man with a neutral face approached my building and asked about an upstairs tenant who no longer lived there. He wrote my name down in a small pad and left. His handwriting was steady. That same night Thomas called. He had not called since he'd left. His voice on the phone was raw in a way the public letters had not been. He said words like scared and I didn't know and they're making it worse. He said that someone had offered him options he did not want but could not refuse, that there were choices to be made for survival, not just reputation. For the first time I heard the man I knew reduced to bargaining. Who? I asked. The question sat between us like an object. He said a name I did not understand. He said it as if it were something from a ledger. After the call I called Owen and left him a message with the name. When he returned my call at midnight, we searched and found that the name belonged to a consultancy fund, a dark cluster of men who dealt quietly in repair and ruin. We were small forces in a much darker machinery. That realization could have been demoralizing or liberating. For me it was both. The next domino fell on a rain-slick Monday. I arrived home to find my door ajar and the apartment disturbed in the way people disturb things when they mean to be careful. A photograph was on my kitchen table. Thomas, a hotel lobby, the man with the neutral face. Someone had been inside my space. They had seen my books, my notebooks, my small domestic map. They had touched the things I touch. The message was clear. Play or be played. That night I did something uncharacteristic. I called Elena. We met at a park bench where the light was poor and the air tasted of wet leaves. Elena arrived with a scarf and a surprising steadiness. She had, I quickly realized, been through her own slow grind. She spoke of moving away, of a job change, of guilt that had crept in later than one might expect. She had not known the breadth of Thomas's financial improvisations. She had thought their affair a private fracture that would heal with time. She, too, had been used as a convenience. I don't want to be useful to someone like him ever again, she said, looking at her hands. But I don't want to be useful to them either. We made an unlikely truce. Not because we were friends, we were not, but because enemies can form alliances when patterns intersect. Elena had access to a social circle Thomas still inhabited in the periphery. She could move in places I could not, and she had a kind of dispassionate cruelty that was useful. I had the records and the hunger for accountability. Together we began to map the men who had circled Thomas when he was at his most exposed. I stopped waiting for the abyss to swallow me whole. I began, instead, to throw light into the gaps. I leaked a small, precise dossier to someone who liked digging into corporate shadows. The journalist wrote a piece that did not name names but described a network of reputation managers and the moral hazards they skirted. It was small. It was surgical. It made the machine twitch. A week later, the gray sedan did not come. The man with the neutral face came to the building once and then no more. Thomas called asking if I had been threatened. I lied and said no. In his voice I heard relief and a sliver of something else. Fear, perhaps, that the house of cards might collapse on him and not only on those who had pushed him. The city did not swing entirely into morality. People are messy. Lawyers are pragmatic. Some clients returned, others did not. Thomas took work that measured him in hours and small bills. He learned, as I had, that survival is not the same as innocence. And me? I kept a ledger. I kept a photo of the last envelope in a small box. A reminder, not a trophy. I learned boundaries in a new way. How to be vigilant without becoming cruel on purpose. How to find companionship without making the person the cause of my strategy. Owen stayed. He did not make the mistakes of heroism. He simply continued to be present. He read me with patience and asked the right questions when I seemed to be slipping back into the architecture. Sometimes, late at night, when the apartment hums and the world is honest with itself, I sit with the ledger and wonder if the war is only paused. The men who repair reputations are like weeds. Cut them and some root systems take longer to die. I think about the photograph on my shelf and about the gray sedan that stopped coming. The city does not forgive or forget. It recalibrates around who holds power at any given moment. If this is not the end, then the new chapter is a quieter kind of readiness. I have become someone who watches and tends and refuses to be slighted into silence. I have also become someone who knows the cost of such vigilance. It is not only reputations that fracture in these wars. It is intimacy, trust, the easy sway of living without a ledger in your pocket. There are nights when I imagine leaving, going somewhere that is not connected to the city's networks. But then I think of those who cannot leave, the friends who are still entangled, the people whose livelihoods depend on reputations kept polished, and I stay. I cultivate a small, fierce hope that accountability can be a long, slow thing and that the architecture I built might one day be repurposed not for punishment but for prevention. Thomas sent a message once, 2 years on, with a photo of a mountain and the words "I'm getting better." I did not respond. Healing, I have learned, is not a photograph. It is an accumulation of days that refuse to reconstruct the lies. If you want more, there are still threads to pull. A new player with a clean suit and unclean hands. A whistleblower who turns out to be less naive than they claim. A court case that forces me to stand and give testimony in a place lit by 1,000 cameras. There is always another plan. Another risk. Perhaps I will be forced to choose again between quiet patience and loud exposure. For now, I keep the ledger, fold the photograph back into its envelope, and let the radiator sigh. The city hums on. The gray sedan is a memory. The man who once loved me like property is reduced to something less impressive. A man who must rebuild himself without the tools of deceit. I think that is enough for now. My name is Mia. The story is not over. It is only quieter, and in the quiet I sharpen myself for whatever comes next.